Hello, this is Gizmo, and it's finally time to get into my modular pop-up headlight mod. Another few week, another mod, another video to help you use it to its full potential. So here we've got two pop-ups. One is vanilla from the game, the other is made of separate parts from my mod. And say I decided that this pop-up is opening too far up because of the angle on which it is attached to. So I decide to say I'm going to remove the cardinal lock and make it open less, so it's a bit more reasonable, except now it's looking downward to the ground, which is bad because every part of this singular fixture is together, so when you rotate something, everything rotates with it. With my mod, everything is separate, so what thing you can do is grab the shell and remove cardinal lock, and already you have it less open, but everything else inside of it did not move. So right off the bat, this is two different opening angle for the same shell. Then there's the thing where I copied literally every shell of the mod to give it one or two separate variant. One of them is a conforming mesh, the other is an additional mesh. So what do I mean by that? Well, in modding, when you make a fixture for automation, you can make your fixture from 4 different types of thing, and the fixture can have 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of those types of things. There's the conforming mesh, the additional mesh, the UV mesh, and the skin mesh. For the purpose of this video, we can immediately forget UV and skin mesh. We don't need to talk about them at all. But for conforming and additional, basically, if you look here, this is an example of a fixture that's basically just a conforming mesh. As you can see, it follows the shape of the body. And if I use cardinal lock, just move it a bit. If I use cardinal lock on it, it doesn't really change all that much. It still follows the shape of the body. But here you can see from the green outline that the inside is sort of pointing at an angle because it's following the angle of the surface on which it's on. But if I turn cardinal lock on, now the only big difference is that everything looks like it's pointing upward, which doesn't change much. Also, you can scale this one in width or in length independently. This, however, from one of my other mod, it would be a fixture that's only an additional mesh. The additional mesh does not follow the shape of the body, so it's entirely pointing, its direction is entirely dictated by the point of contact with the car, which in this case is around here. So if I turn cardinal lock on, the entire shape rotates and does not change. And so when you scale it, instead of going independently in 2 directions, it scales in 3 dimensions, but all at the same time. So you can only make it bigger or smaller. That's the difference between conforming and additional. Now this means that I've got different copies of each shell, and I've plugged one as a conforming mesh and the other as a non-conforming mesh. So this one, for example, it doesn't show much because there's not much around, but here you can see that this one has a slight curve because it's conforming to the slight curve underneath it, which make it look like it's fitting more on this car, whereas this one is perfectly flat. And in different circumstances, you might want the flat one because the shape underneath would make it transform in weird ways. More often than not, it's going to make it too far closed. It's not going to open far enough if you use the conforming one. But the conforming one, if you can make it work, is really good because you can scale it, which you can see right here with this one. This is a pop-up in a hole that's way too small, way too big. If I scale it, it goes big, but it does not go wide only, so that doesn't work. If I find it in its own family, I can find the one that conforms and scale it only in one direction until it fits the hole, which makes for a lot more variation and possibilities with those pop-ups. And there's actually a nifty trick that I found out while playing around with this. Since I've got conforming and non-conforming variants of the same thing in the same family, I can go and use the conforming one, scale it however I want, and then switch back to the non-conforming one that I'm not supposed to be able to scale. And as you can see now, this one is perfectly flat because it's not supposed to be scaled, and yet it kept all of the scaling information from the other one, which is extremely useful. Also, you can take cardinal lock up and down and it works. Whereas if I stayed with the conforming one and used cardinal lock, as you can see, it's constantly popping back down again in order to follow the shape of the car. But the non-conforming one does not do that. Of course, as soon as you touch scale, it will update and break, but that's still very, very useful. And if you're a dev and you've just seen this and you consider it a bug, it's not a bug, and don't fix it. Don't you dare. Now, there are also, of course, as you can see in the pop-up shell family, a ton of different variants to choose from. And it goes from closed caps all the way to different angled or straight shells opening in different angles and in different ways, and also conforming or not, as I said earlier. Some other pop-up family will also have a black lip in the front to make things like the AE86, which has this kind of let me just show you instead. I'll pick, say, this one. Obviously this is not the right hole for it, but as you can see, this one has a black lip that goes down, and that's for when you're making a pop-up that's wrapping around the front of a car, like the car from Initial D, for example. Now, most of these fixtures have the contact point in the back, and in some cases it can be extremely useful. For instance, this right here is a closed cap, but I've got this one is following the shape of the body, it's conforming. I've got a variant that's non-conforming, and it, at first glance, it looks a bit pointless because it's just a version that does not close correctly, but actually if you use it with cardinal lock, it will become horizontal. And of course, with this example, the body does not slope down very far, so it doesn't look very useful, but in a more aggressive sloping hood, this would make for a very low horizontal pop-up opening. But that's not the most useful version of this that I have. The most useful would be this one right here. It teleported back just here because its contact point is not in the back, it's in the front right here. And if I put it here and I do the same thing, I use cardinal lock to make it rotate around the contact point, it ends up going inside and making a pop down headlight. And as you can see right here, unlike the other socket, there is one here which, as you can see from the outline, it goes back inside here and has like a chamber inside of which you can fit the variants of the interior parts that goes under the body, like say this one, for example. Now, there is a problem that happens sometimes where the game decides to start to consider the frontmost part of the hood as part of the front of the car instead of part of the top. And this means that things using cardinal lock will try to cardinal lock forward instead of up, like this, which can be a problem when some of the part of the mod in question, including my pop-up mod, requires to be used with cardinal lock, like the interior part, for example. And some of the parts won't have that much of a problem with this because their contact point is in the back, and the problem does not start until the contact point goes past a certain threshold, which is right here. So as you can see, I can move almost 90% of this socket inside of the problem area without it having any problem. It only starts to have a problem if I move it past like this. And it's the same thing with the shells. So that cannot be that much of a problem for that if the problem is larger. On certain bodies it can take up to 2 feet of hood space, which is bad for headlights. But if you decide to use, say, a shell but without cardinal lock, then you won't have a problem even if you put it inside of the problem area. This is a bad example. See here. So this one, technically, because it's not using cardinal lock, it still opens the right way. But if I use... oh, actually it's not the problem. There. So if I'm not using cardinal lock, it works normally. If I do, then it doesn't. Obviously here it's kind of dumb because that problem only happened in the first few inches of the hood. But in other car it can be much more of a problem. And of course, so I couldn't correct every part by giving them a variant with a 90-degree rotational offset, because the mod is already big enough as it is, and everything about this problem is an edge case, and it will be corrected by the 3D fixture position that comes in the next update. But there are still things like the inside parts which need a corrected variant like these. Just going to find one that's above. I guess I could do this. And then use one of those front-facing ones. In order to make a pop-up headlight that works even inside of this problematic area. Also, when it comes to the pop down, the problem obviously will happen again, especially since you need cardinal lock to make the cap pop down, except the cap has its contact point in the front, so that becomes a problem. And most family therefore were given a variant that looks like this, which is again a variant with a offset in rotation in order to fix that problem. It can be easier to use the arrow keys to fine-tune the position at that point. Anyway, you get the idea. At this point it's time to move to the back of the truck, and you can see why I've used this truck instead of a sports car for this video. It's because of this huge sloped area which gave me a lot of space to show off my variants. So as you can see, there's a few different types of shape that you can choose from. I'm just going to focus on this one specifically for now. The reason I wanted to show this one off in particular is because I decided to use it to show off that these two materials, the lens and the side panels on the shells, are grid and glass, obviously. So that means there is the translucent option in both, which gives you the option to remove them entirely in case you decide to make a pop-up where the cap is overhanging more over the interior and is supported by the center or stuff like that. So that's another possibility that you can do instead of just keeping the sides and the lens as they come with the shell by default. And also I very much like removing the lens that I made by default on the shells, because usually those pop-ups add only a lens on the unit themselves like this. That would be more accurate. Now at this point I'd like to show things off in the list here, because I've just realized playing around with my mod that a bunch of times the fixtures in the list will change space. Like for example, earlier today these 4 families of fixtures from my pre-war lamp pack were not next to one another, they were spread out. So when I load, oftentimes you'll see most of the families from my mods are all together. Well, they actually are all together, I think. Well, oftentimes you'll find one or a group of them lower down in the list, so just don't forget to look all the way down. Sometimes you might find that some of them have moved. I just wanted to point that out. Also, this family here, which has a bunch of previews which are quite underwhelming, are actually the future pop-up family. Basically this thing, it's kind of a panel that expands with glass materials. Basically this one here is one too. As you can see, in this case I've made yellow glass in the back and red glass in the front, and it's completely translucent from both sides because the center has been made transparent. And the reason why we don't see the shells as the preview is because obviously these are one of the few families actually in my mod that needed their own interior parts inside of inside of themselves, instead of it being a part of the rest of the interior parts, because they were too different and the basic one didn't fit with this strange kind of shapes. Talking about the interior, here is the basic, the kind of part that you can find in the interior family, the family for the interior parts of the pop-ups. So this is basically like a fill block that I call. It's plastic shape that you can use to add some material behind a pop-up interior if you feel like it's too empty inside, especially if you've removed the side like I've showed earlier. This is what most interior parts will look like, and those two things here, the bulbs and the chrome part alone, these two are basically an early version of these, which I've decided to leave in case someone finds a use for them, but they don't have variation for every position available because these are much more practical and easier to use. These are the Opel GT lights. They don't really fit the bill because they're not modular. I couldn't find a way to make them work modular, so I decided instead to just, you know, make them as a normal feature and tag them along with the rest of the mod. Then I'm going to move to the 928, the Porsche 928 light here, which is round. Just wanted to point out that this interior unit has different height available. Like this one is much lower because depending on the angle of the hood you might need it to be lower or higher, so I gave 3 options. The sockets for these lights, they came in 3 different types. So there's the one that's shallow like in the Porsche 928, then there's the one that's more of a deep dish, which is good for stuff like the Mura, because then the separate fixture used for decoration, this kind of eyelash thing, does not actually work all that well with the shallow one. It's kind of all hidden. So this one is deeper expressly for the purpose of being decorated by something else. And then I made a variant with grills because it kind of made sense. It's an easy variation on the same theme. Here I've got a family of square pop-ups which is separate from the normal square pop-up family because it's basically a 928 thing where it deploys and closes flush with the body with the light exposed, but in a square shape instead. Also, I've got variants of this one which are complete instead of being modular, or this one's empty, but you get the build. Like this one is a completed fixture on its own, but you still have separate parts in case you want to do something funky with it. Finally, one of the last things that I have to talk about is the roll down headlights. These right here are for the Corvette C2. This one, as you can see, fits perfectly in its socket, where this one is popping up too far up. The reason for this is that this is a variant that's meant to be used on a front-facing surface like it is right now, whereas this one is meant to be used around the curve like this. So the headlight unit can raise higher, since as it's wrapping down, the hole tends to be less high. So I gave it a bit more height in the non-conforming unit to cope for that. Talking about stuff that's meant to be placed around a curved surface, there's the Alfa Romeo Montreal pop-up, where the cap goes around the edge into the hood. Of course, this one also has its own interior parts because they're more farther inside the body, otherwise it might get through the cap as it's sloping inward. As you can see, this Alfa Romeo pop-up base has a jagged edge here, and that's because it's meant to be combined with a grille like this, otherwise it's not really complete. Or what you can do is you grab another one and you combine them together to make it fully closed, since it's not normally fully closed. So these are things that you can do. And you can also well, first off, if you open it, normally it would flop down like this, so it rotates down, but there's also a variant where the cap is rotating outward like this, in case that's what you're after. And this, I believe, covers everything that I had to say about this mod, and I'm finally able to let you enjoy it and explore it as you see fit.